In this lesson, we're going to look at the United States under the administrations of Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Carter. And I call this America in the 1970s, but I'm actually starting where we left off in 1968 and going all the way to 1980. So let's begin with the events of 1968. 1968 was an election year. Lyndon Johnson was president. He was a Democrat, and he was planning on running for a second term. The problem was the United States was still embroiled in Vietnam. We'd been fighting the war in Vietnam for several years, and in order to have a chance of winning, Johnson felt that he had to convince the American people that we were on the verge of winning the war. So Johnson called his top general home from Vietnam and had him give a speech in Congress. And in this speech, he claimed that victory was right around the corner. The U.S., he claimed, was killing North Vietnamese soldiers faster than they could be replaced. And it was only a matter of time before North Vietnam had to give up. Then came the Tet Offensive. This was in January of 1968. This was a massive attack by North Vietnamese forces. They attacked over 100 targets in South Vietnam. Remember, the point of the Vietnam War was to keep South Vietnam from being taken over by the communist government of North Vietnam. Well, during the Tet Offensive, North Vietnam attacks over 100 targets in South Vietnam. And there's American reporters in South Vietnam who are capturing all of this on film. So Americans back home are watching this on their televisions, and it's very clear that we are not on the verge of winning this war. So this essentially destroys any chance that Johnson had of winning re-election, and it leads to the term credibility gap. The credibility gap was the gap between what the government claimed was happening in Vietnam and what was actually happening in Vietnam. In other words, this was a way of saying the government tells us lies. We can't trust what they tell us. And after the Tet Offensive, after it becomes clear that we are not about to win this war, Johnson gave a speech on national television saying that he would start peace negotiations with North Vietnam and that he would not run for a second term. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. King was in Memphis supporting a sanitation workers' strike. 2 African American sanitation workers had been killed by a faulty garbage truck, and the rest of the sanitation worker force had gone on strike and refused to go back to work until they received higher pay and safer working conditions. So King was in Memphis to support this strike, and on April 4th, 1968, as he was stepping out of his motel room onto the balcony at the Lorraine Motel, he was shot by a sniper across the street, who was later identified as an escaped convict named James Earl Ray. And African Americans across the country were outraged by King's murder, and many of them began to riot. There were riots in Memphis, in Chicago, in Baltimore, in Washington, D.C. There were literally buildings burning 3 blocks away from the White House. And this scared a lot of Americans. And would play a role in the upcoming election. So as I said, Johnson withdrew from the election, so the Democratic nomination was really up for grabs. There were several Democrats who were looking to run for president that year. One of them was Robert F. Kennedy, or RFK for short. This was President John F. Kennedy's younger brother. And he was a fairly popular candidate. He reminded a lot of people of his brother, but he unfortunately was assassinated in Los Angeles in June of 1968. He was actually he had actually just won the California Democratic primary, which was a fairly big victory, and he gave a victory speech thanking all of his campaign workers, walked away from the podium, and was shot by a Middle Eastern immigrant named Sirhan Sirhan. And he shot Kennedy because Kennedy supported Israel. So some people consider his assassination to be the beginning of America's troubles with the Middle East, but we'll get into that some more later. In August of 1968, the Democratic Party held their national convention in Chicago. And remember, the national convention is where one of the parties, in this case the Democratic Party, meets to choose who they are going to nominate for president. At this point, there were two candidates. There was Eugene McCarthy, who was from Minnesota, and he was against the Vietnam War, and there was Hubert Humphrey, who had been Johnson's vice president and supported the war in Vietnam, believed that the United States should stay in Vietnam until we won it. Well, thousands of anti-war protesters showed up to the convention. They surrounded the convention hall, calling for McCarthy to be nominated. They did not want a candidate who would keep the United States in Vietnam. Well, nobody is sure exactly what happened, but the Chicago police more or less attacked the protesters and started beating them with their police sticks. And this was later called a police riot. And this really injured the image of the Democratic Party. Now, the candidate that the Democrats ended up nominating was Hubert Humphrey. And by doing so, they essentially stated that they wanted to stay in Vietnam. Remember, Hubert Humphrey had been Lyndon Johnson's vice president, and he supported the war in Vietnam. Now, as the election grew closer, he actually switched gears and turned against Vietnam. But in the end, it wasn't enough to win the election. The Republicans nominated Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had served as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower for 8 years. In 1960, he ran for president but lost to John F. Kennedy. And a few years after that, ran for governor of California and lost that election as well. So by the mid-1960s, it looked like Richard Nixon's political career was over. Well, in 1968, he shows back up, and he runs for president as a Republican, which he had always been, and he uses a couple of strategies that help him in the election. The Southern strategy. So this essentially, remember the court case Brown versus Board of Education. Very important court case. This stated that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, and it called for schools to integrate their students as quickly as possible. Nixon's Southern strategy was to say, hey, I'm against segregation, but I think that each state should choose how quickly it should integrate its students. So if Mississippi thinks that it's going to take 10 years before they can have black students and white students going to school together, Mississippi should take 10 years to do that. This worked very well with Southern white voters. Many Southern white voters were already disappointed with the Democratic Party. Remember, the South had been Democratic since Reconstruction, but in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson, who was a Democrat, had signed the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965, which made segregation in public places illegal and made practices such as poll taxes and literacy tests, which were meant to keep African Americans from voting, also illegal. So these laws really disappointed a lot of white Southerners. And here's Nixon, who's a Republican, saying you should be able to take as long as you want to put your white students with your black students. So this is really the beginning of the switch from white Southerners voting for Democrats to white Southerners voting for Republicans. Nixon also appealed to lower class and middle class Americans, whom he called the Great Silent Majority. He promised that he was going to be tough on crime. And this was an issue that scared a lot of middle class and working class Americans. Remember, there had been riots that had broken out after Martin Luther King was assassinated. There had been riots before that. There had been the Watts riot in Los Angeles in 1965. There had been the Detroit riot in 1967. So many Americans were very scared of this rise in crime. And Nixon promised to be tough on crime. And he also promised to bring peace with honor in Vietnam. He did not explain how he was going to do this, but he did say, I will get us out of Vietnam and I will do it with honor. So what is the outcome? Richard Nixon wins the election and he becomes our 37th president.